Hello and welcome. I'm John Harl, Executive Director of INASP. What you're about to watch is a conversation we convened on the 30th of June about Africa's pharmaceutical future. I'm delighted you're joining us, whether you were with us on the day and want to listen again, or if you're catching it for the first time. We brought together a thoughtful and experienced group of colleagues, experience ranging across research, policy, finance, and industry, to explore one of the most important questions facing health and science systems and people across the continent. How can Africa build a homegrown pharmaceutical manufacturing system, one that secures both its health security and its economic security, or that improves health outcomes and creates skilled jobs for young people? 70% of the continent's pharmaceuticals and medicines are imported, 99% of its vaccines. 8 African countries account for most of what's produced. And most importantly, this gap translates into 750 million people who don't have regular access to essential medicine. The opportunity is significant. There's growing momentum. New structures and platforms are being created. Around $3.2 billion has been committed. Much of that is yet to be deployed. But as the discussion makes clear, the challenge is not just how to mobilize capital. The constraints are knowledge, skills, and the regulatory infrastructure that allow investment to translate into real capability at scale. There are governance issues here too. Crucially, we need to be building a pipeline for the future we want. Dr. Nora Ndege sets the scene: a continent confined to the low value end of production, and a workforce challenge where up to 400,000 skilled roles may be needed by 2035 on some estimates. Industrial chemists, engineers, quality assurance managers, regulatory specialists. Dr. Henry Fomendan from the Africa Consistency Bureau takes on regulation, drawing on his experience with the African Medicines Agency. He takes us through the complexities of a 3-tier system with much overlap and duplication, and with insufficient coordination between countries. Dr. Susan Winks from the H3D Foundation in Cape Town asks, why is everyone getting excited about a finished product without asking how it's actually made, when Africa still imports around 95% of its active pharmaceutical ingredients? But she shows us that we really should be thinking about advanced R&D and production. Jeff Bander of the University of Edinburgh reminds us that global health security is built on the foundations of local health security, and explores the linkages needed across the value chain and the role of private and public actors. And finally, Professor Judith Magwagwa from University College London offers a challenge that cuts through it all. Policy tends to imagine capability, but our systems keep reproducing dependency. Why is that, and how can we change it? It's a frank, engaging conversation. There's a written summary to accompany it, and we'll be taking the conversation further soon. But for now, enjoy the session, and please get in touch if this has prompted interesting questions and you want to talk to us more about it.
Thanks very much, John, for setting us up and setting the scene. So what I'm going to share is just the work that we've been doing as scoping in terms of the skills and the finance landscape when it comes to African pharmaceutical manufacturing. And this is just broadly on the literature, but also through the engagement that we've had with the Africa CDC and, of course, other partners that John has already mentioned. And thanks, John, again for highlighting, the challenge of Africa's reliance on external supply chains. One of the core challenges is around the local manufacturers who depend quite heavily on imported active pharmaceutical ingredients. So currently, it's estimated that these form 95% of inputs. And what this means is that we are only able to capture the lower end of the value chain, that is 20 to 30%, because of this high dependency of medicines importation, medical devices. And what this shows is that the average facility capacity utilization is around 30 to 60%. So what's the other gap? Is around higher education institutions. While they offer, pharmaceutical training, this is a bit low, and out of this number, East Africa community alone, we have 888 higher education institution offering training around this. So there's a bit of a workforce challenge. But the good news is that there is still an opportunity. We've seen capital that is committed, although not yet deployed, about US $3.2 billion that has been pledged by Africa CDC in 25 alone. We have Africa Development Bank and Gavi. But we are moving towards these, but there are insufficient bankable projects to really absorb this amount that has been committed. And of course, what is needed is really the workforce capacity, the knowledge infrastructure to de-risk these investments. And the Africa Union target by 2040 is that we'll be able to manufacture about 60% of local vaccines. So how does the landscape in terms of production and the economics of it look like? What we see is that a lot of African farms, like 95% of African farms are, at the lower level where it's about finish and fill. And in terms of active pharmaceutical ingredient production, it's very limited. So that's the level 4. But of course, there are emerging prospects and R&D based production where we really need to be there, including, producing our own API. This is nearly absent, and this is where skills are sort of highly demanded. And what this means is that we need to grow the workforce. This is as per the Africa CDC data that they shared with us. We need to grow the workforce full-time equivalents in Africa pharmaceutical manufacturing, to about 403,000. That is by 2035. And this is fourfolds when it comes to, sector specific when you're looking at vaccine manufacture. So as per this data, they looked at the largest demand and supply gaps. So, for example, automation and instrumentation, we have 88% of higher education offering no training in this particular area. But of course, in terms of the needs, highest demands, we have opportunities to build capacities, capabilities on quality assurance, quality control. And so for us, our response is really to a twin track in order to build the talent pipeline. First of all is workforce development and also, building capability for API production and R&D to move up the value chain. So that's more on advanced innovation. And the idea is really to align and extend treasury training to existing demand. So, support capacity around industrial chemists, pharmacies, regulatory affairs, and all these areas, but also at the higher end of, the value chain so that we are able to capture about 60 to 80%, because currently we are 20 to 30% of the value chain. So I think I'll leave it at that. This was just in terms of setting the scene and what the scoping study is already pointing us towards. So John, let me hand it back to you for the next presentation.
Thank you, Nora. That's great. So we wanted to just give a snapshot of some of the work we've been doing to learn from what's already known. As Nora said, there are some reports cited there from our colleagues at Africa CDC and elsewhere, just to give a sense of where we start from. But let's now dive a bit deeper and let's go to the kind of regulatory aspects of this system. I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Henry Fomendan to talk to us now. Dr. Fomendan is the Executive Director of the African Constituency Bureau, which represents Africa's 46 member countries at the Global Fund. And Dr. Fomendan brings 30 years of experience in academia in South Africa and in the US. He was leading Howard University's Global Health Initiative and PEPFAR programming. Especially interesting, I think, for today's conversation is that Dr. Fomendan was centrally involved in developing the operating framework for the new Africa Medicines Agency. So Dr. Fomendan, over to you, please. We're really keen to hear your thoughts and insights.
Thank you very much, Joan. Thank you, Nora, for setting the scene, and thank you, colleagues. I think you're going to have to let me share. So, Joan, that was a good summary. My work primarily has been in the area of academia, in the area of medicine regulation, where in South Africa I served on the Clinical Trials Committee, Pharmacovigilance Committee, but within the region, I've also been able to work with NEPAD to draft out the framework on which AMA is operating. At the UN Commission for Africa, I was able to assist them to look at how regulation is going to affect pool procurement, which they were trying to do around the continent. Within SADC, help the regulatory process to set up centers of excellence and centers of specialization. But last year, I was talking to a group of private investors who want to invest in the pharmaceutical sector in Africa. And I clearly told them that this is a case of looking at it as a case of half a glass full. There are lots of opportunities on the continent in the area of pharmaceutical. There are also lots of challenges, which are very endemic to the continent, but there's been progress that is being made. But just telling you about the fact that I've just recently started as the executive director for the African Constituency Bureau, like John said. We directly involved in making sure that 46 countries are more efficient in managing HIV, TB, and malaria. And so that's basically the work that we do. And with the dwindling finances, we're trying to make sure that people have become more efficient. And so that's why we're still involved in medicine regulation, making sure that we can have more access to the treatment, more efficient in managing the top diseases that we find in Africa. So that's what this slide is saying. But in terms of medicine regulation, which is our topic for today, and local manufacturing on the continent, what I just want to point out, which is what I pointed to the investors last year, was that when it comes to policy in general, but pharmaceutical policy specifically, the problem that we have on the continent is that our institutions are weak. There's improvement on a number of them. There's unclear responsibilities and poor coordination in some of the cases. However, you have to understand the realities as we encourage our private investors to invest into the pharmaceutical sector because it is lucrative. But you must understand the infrastructure, the business infrastructure, and the pharmaceutical infrastructure on the continent. I wanted to start with just asking a number of questions, and you don't have to answer them immediately, but what is the regulatory responsibility and interconnectivity of the three levels of medicine pharmaceutical regulation on the continent? There's a continental outfit, AMA. There's a regional economic bloc, which also is involved in medicine regulation, and then there's the National Regulatory Authority. Can we effectively submit product registration dossiers to which level? And where do you then have to submit? These are ongoing discussions, and some of them are more advanced than some of the other regions. And is AMA and the regional economic blocks, are they considered as regulatory authority? What is the definition of local manufacturing, especially if you have to take advantage of the African continental free trade area? Some people have defined it as 60% of the API, so that we're not getting into just importing API from China and then we put them into capsules and things like that. And if you go to pharmaceutical school, you learn that is considered manufacturing, but is that the degree of manufacturing that we're talking about on the continent? Countries and regs have local manufacturing plans for the same market. And I was invited in Botswana at BVI, wanted to start manufacturing human vaccines because for 40 something years they've been doing animal vaccines. The question was, it's a small country, but have we spoken to the rest of the other people on what Botswana wants to manufacture? Because there's no point of Botswana manufacturing, South Africa manufacturing the same product. And I think there's some advancement and discussions on that level. In the quest for self-reliance, WHO has been doing a lot, pre-qualification. Where do they fall now? How do we interface with them? And if you look at something like pool procurement you would think is a low-hanging fruit. Why has pool procurement not picked up on this continent the way we expect it by region, a group of countries? And how do we ensure that locally manufactured health commodities targeting Africa will actually be cheaper? That's part of the problem that we've had in the past, where there's some local manufacturers that produce products, but because the funding is not from within the country, the funder basically determines where and who you buy from. And so that makes it very challenging. Is that still going to prevail? And how do we take advantage of the African continental free trade area that we're talking about in terms of moving the pharmaceutical products across the borders? Um, right now, you can move them across the borders in some certain specific cases, but you can't even move people across the border, and that's a challenge. And what is stalling African collaborative efforts in harmonization, domestication of the model law, ratification of AMA? Only 31 countries have ratified AMA. Only 9 countries in all of the African countries are actually at maturity level 3. So these are realities on the continent. We're making progress, but for private investors, we caution them to say, you must understand this infrastructure and understand that progress is happening, but gradually. Um, so it's the anchor for pool procurement and local manufacturing is medicine regulation, which means you could come with big plans and everything. If you don't understand the medicine regulation ecosystem on the continent, you're going to be frustrated. And it's important to understand it. And that's part of what I'm talking about today. Harmonization is a major issue. This was a practical definition that I did for NEPAD when we're working on trying to set up what AMA is going to look like. So you're asking 55 countries to be able, who are at different levels, be it the systems, the organization, the procedures, to be able to get together as in the form of harmonization, which we always remind them that we're not talking about uniformity because we're going to fail before we even start. We try to customize based on the peculiarities that you have in each country. So these are some of the significant barriers that we have in terms of pharmaceutical. The market is fragmented in different ways. There's duplication. Neighboring countries require you submitting dossiers. We're seeing that it's beginning to change. But if the regional economic bloc is not really a regulatory authority to enforce, it means that whenever they review a dossier, and which is what is going to happen to AMA, when I was putting together the document for AMA, the biggest criticism that I had for the treaty was the fact that AMA cannot enforce anything. AMA can review the large molecules, the biosimilars, but it's up to the national regulatory authority to take it or leave it. And so it duplicates efforts in that sense. The maturity level, we're saying up till now, only 9 countries are at maturity level 3, which is a little bit disappointing. GMP inspection, we shouldn't be having multiple GMP inspections on this continent if we're trying to save costs. Quality control is the same thing with the laboratories that we want to put in place. We should be able to share across. Domestication we've spoken about. And then this incentives that we've spoken about, that putting a proper state-of-the-art facility for local manufacturing would require that you have to recoup the funding. But how do you recoup the funding if the various countries are not buying through this process? If you have not agreed that within this region, people will have to buy. So all of this is circled around medicine regulation, but also some of the laws that we have in the various countries. These are just some significant work that is going on, which is good. AMA, like I said, was a dream deferred. We should have come up with AMA many years ago, but it is here. But like we said, it's not, it can enforce a lot of things. We're seeing that there's a scaling of vaccine manufacturing hubs. That's beautiful. That we should agree so that we don't have individual countries acting on knee-jerk reaction. when there was no COVID vaccine, a lot of countries in Africa, when you talk to them, they're telling you that we want to start manufacturing our own COVID vaccines, and that's not possible. So we want this kind of hubs that are existing, that are agreed on by the continent. We spoke about the level three, a few countries, and then market shaping commitments. Are we going to be able to buy when these local manufacturing houses come in place that they're producing medications? That's number one. If they produce medications, would they end up being cheaper than importing the medicines from out of the continent? So these are things that we must be able to put into consideration and think about it. NEPAD at some point came up with 24 products that we think, based on the formulary, should be the products that should be prioritized in manufacturing. This is just showing you, this is the work that I did towards AMA. It's showing you that this continent has three levels of manufacturing, of regulation. There's the outer one, which is continental at the level of AMA. There's the inner one, which you see at the regs, which is highlighted. I took SADC, and then there's the National Regulatory Authority. This is nice on paper, but who should do what? It's not properly spelled out. What should AMA do? What should we manufacture, and how should we regulate it at the level of the regs? How should we do it at the National Medicine Regulatory Authority? Keep in mind that the treaty that brought AMA into fruition says in Article 4 that the main objective of AMA is to enhance the capacity of the regs and the National Medicine Regulatory Authority in the process of medicine and healthcare commodity regulation. What does enhance mean? What can be enforced? So these are the things that we're still hoping that policy is going to be able to define even better as progress is going on. Again, these are the regional economic communities that you find, about 8 of them on this continent. Are they talking to each other? You also find a challenge, which I saw, that there are countries that belong to a lot of countries belong to 2 of them. Some belong to 3 of them. Some of the work that I did was qualitative. When I asked, everybody was like, it's an advantage to belong to multiple regional economic communities. I didn't think so, but that's what everybody that I interviewed said. They thought it was a great idea. And of course, this is just telling you what we expect of AMA, what we expect of the regs. Now, I wanted to bring this slide. This is one of the slides that I put in my report that I did for this. These are, when AMA was not in place, it therefore meant that there were a lot of partners and collaborators that were in place. There was AMRH of NEPAD, there was WHO, there was the Africa CDC that is in place. We were using EMA as a benchmark to see how we could do, but it doesn't really directly correlate. EMA has 33 countries, the continent 55, the GDP is huge compared to Africa. So there are a number of things that we could copy for them, but we have to customize everything. So these players, how do we get them now to work? Because they're still very relevant, and how do we get them to work together? And because I don't have time, I can't go through what I suggested each of them should be doing, because right now some of them are overlapping and in this space. So things need to be defined in order for things to work properly and say, this is the issue that we're talking about, policies. And I needed to mention what I'd mentioned here, that consumer involvement is going to be critical in Africa, because when you saw the vaccine hesitancy, both for malaria vaccine, for COVID vaccine, even for any vaccine that you're bringing to the continent now, there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation. And it should never be dismissed, because it's very historic. The things that happened in 1932 and everywhere, particularly with the Black population, it's still resonating, and it's all over the social media. So a lot of people take onto that. So we need to make sure that we're involving consumers in medicine regulation on the continent. This is probably going to be my second to the last slide. Here is what I want to say, that everybody is now focusing on access, on availability, and sometimes affordability, but it doesn't usually translate into optimal treatment outcomes if you don't focus on it. And we're used to, on the continent, doing things in silos. This is something that I would heavily recommend, that it has to be integrated to make sure that as we have access through local manufacturing, we have to have a policy in place which puts the regulatory authority closer to the people in terms of are we getting, why is the continent still very heavily the highest continent with counterfeit medicines, despite the fact that almost all the countries now, Seychelles now has a regulatory authority. All the countries now have a regulatory authority. So what is the regulatory authority doing when minimum of 500,000 people die on this continent from counterfeit medicine or substandard and falsified medicine every year? So we have to do a medicine regulatory authority that is very patient-centered, very people-oriented in order to address the issues. Otherwise, we're going to do local manufacturing, and then we find out that we still have not really improved the treatment outcomes. And then lastly, I had wanted to be an architect in my life, but I never became one. So this is why I'm drawing. This is what I did for the AMA assignment and for UNECA, that the house on medicine regulation on the continent should look something like this. And I would not have time to go through it. The top and the bottom is what I want to talk about, the roof and the foundation. The foundation actually depends on the African governments. And people always say government will. I no longer use the word government will because all the African countries have a government will to make sure that they make medicines available to their population. What I use is prioritization. They need to prioritize because they have the will to do many, many things and they end up not doing them. So we need to make sure that we prioritize. We need to make sure that there's financing the allocation. We spoke about the Abuja Declaration since 20-something years ago, where 15% of the GDP of the treasury basket needs to be going to health. I think it's only one or two countries that have been able to comply with that for 20-something years. The human resources. I am of the opinion that we need to start involving Africans in the diaspora, whether it's in the Caribbean and everywhere that I travel, I meet with them. They want to contribute to this continent. And I think we're lacking totally in the human resources expertise to be able to run a pharmaceutical process the way we would like to. And lastly, the infrastructure. So this house has a number of pillars, it has a number of a ceiling, it has a roof, which I think is the construction of the pharmaceutical regulatory system that will enhance local manufacturing on the continent. I think I would end here, and sorry I had to run because of the time that John gave me. Thank you.
Dr. Pomendan, thank you very much. That was a masterclass in the regulatory space on the continent. Thank you. I think that gives us an awful lot to get our teeth into now. So thank you. Before we move to questions, I'd like to hand over to a trio of speakers first. We're going to cover some more of these intersections between science, innovation, and financing on the continent. I'll introduce them all first, and then I'll hand over to them to kick us off. So firstly, Dr. Susan Winks. Her career has gone from the lab bench to business. So after many years as a scientist, she joined Kelly Jabali's team at H3D Foundation in Cape Town to lead on business development and partnerships. And so she brings a really unique view today. Welcome, Susan. Dr. Jeffrey Banda, trained in genetics and microbiology, began his career in Zimbabwe's biomedical industry, then took a tour through banking and finance, which I think gives a particularly interesting perspective on these questions, and is now one of our leading experts in life science innovation based at the University of Edinburgh in the UK. And last but not least, Professor Julius Magwagwa began a career in biosciences in Zimbabwe and in pharmaceuticals before taking the academic route to become a leading scholar of Africa's innovation systems and public policy, particularly regarding health and pharmaceutical innovation systems, and is now based at University College London. So welcome both of you too. Jeff and Julius and their colleagues literally wrote the book on this topic, and it was their book in many ways that sparked the conversation that we're having today. So Making Medicines in Africa, and then a follow-up volume, Cancer Care in Pandemic Times. So they've posed and answered some very important questions in both of those volumes, which take Africa's health sovereignty and security as really core topics here. Jeff, let's start with you, if we can. What does a durable Africa-led pharmaceutical innovation ecosystem actually require beyond what we currently have?
Thanks, John. And thanks for the introduction. Good morning to everyone. I have a number of issues that I've been puzzling over for quite some time. And you'll notice from the presentation that Nora gave and everyone else has looked at, they tend to focus on production within the pharmaceutical company, whereas the pharmaceutical company is part of a broader or wider value chain. And so my suggestion of a more resilient ecosystem is building both backward and forward linkages in the value chain. And when we look at backward linkages, it's mostly API production for the small molecules and the starter material for biologics. Sometimes we talk about these things as if they're not happening on the continent, but as far back as 2012, 2013, Ethiopia was already working on using cornstarch as because it's one of the key excipients in pharmaceutical manufacturing. So there is work that is going on, and what just needs to be done is to scale up this work. CPT Pharma in South Africa, I think I met them 2 or 3 years ago, were working on the API for dolutegravir. And there's something that Dr. Fumondan said that we don't think about when we think of these ecosystems for African pharmaceutical manufacturing, that's the intersection between animal health and human health. So you'll find that some of these skills that we require in the African human health actually exist already in animal health. So whether it is vaccine manufacturing or API manufacturing, what's important is actually making sure that there's an open or revolving door between these two sectors. So those are the kind of backward linkages, but I guess also sideways linkages across sectors. The second one that I want to look at is the forward linkage. We may talk as much as we can about local pharmaceutical manufacturing, but for as long as we don't solve the local procurement of products, it will be difficult to scale up local pharmaceutical manufacturing. It's a challenge that has been going on for maybe for the last decades. And one of the arguments that we've made is that innovative procurement, where you actually use public health procurement as active industry policy, is something that's important in terms of building a resilient local industry. So I've covered backward linkages and I've covered forward linkages in terms of the API starter materials and also the innovative procurement. The other element that's important is we have this almost disparate or disjointed niches of activity or experience, either in universities or in research institutions or in the private sector. So there's a need to join up these systems in terms of developing platform technologies for making drugs, or platform technologies for making vaccines, or platform technologies for making medical devices. And these platform technologies, when you then conjoin them, they become part of the platform infrastructure. So the technologies, the networks, and the actors that are involved. The last thing that I'll talk about is stuff that people don't usually consider. That's your national metrology institutions, so your national reference laboratories. We saw this emerge during COVID, that you start to do an innovation, but you need to verify that you've measured something correctly, and or you could not actually find a national reference laboratory to do that. So these are some of the actors in this broader innovation ecosystem that we need to consider. And when we're thinking of training skills, these are some of the I've just picked up a few of the actors that I think are relevant. Julius, you can jump in if I've left any that you think are important.
Is that okay, John?
Please do. Yeah, let's make this a more organic conversation.
Yeah, no, great. Thank you very much, Jeff, for that, and Dr. Fumondam and Nora as well for the points you raised. I think for me, a lot of the points I wanted to raise have actually been captured already, but just to say, I mean, my overarching argument is that Africa's pharmaceutical challenge is not primarily one of the skills or the capital or the science, but it's a problem of governing the systems. And that has come through from all the presentations, really, the linkages, the coordination, the intersections, the linkage, I mean, the connections, coordination, collaboration. For me, that's really the fundamental question. And one thing that actually jumps out of that very immediately is the issue of incumbent practice. Like, how did we get here in the first place, whatever we are trying to do? So there's actually quite a fundamental role around how we've got incumbent procurement and regulatory logics that privilege established global actors, limiting local entry. So for me, that's really fundamental. Even as Dr. Famundam was talking about why is armor not biting yet? Why does it not have teeth? That very good house you build, why is it not operational yet? Those disconnects with the RECs and the National Medicines Regulatory Authority, why are they there? Is because these imaginaries are coming into a context that already has got actors that are there, that are privileged already by what the system can take or can allow. So I would really say, in addition to the capacities that need to be built, we need to really challenge the practices that are there, the incumbent actors that are there, because the coordination failures that we are talking about will remain, because there are incumbents that are actually benefiting from the status quo.
Okay.
For me, that's really, really quite key. So I would also say, even just rethinking from a political economy perspective, that there is probably some kind of political economy denial, but the reality is policy imagines capability, but the systems reproduce dependency. And for me, that's something that needs to be tackled head on. That misalignment between what policy is saying and what the reality on the ground is actually saying. The reality is that we've got systems that are reproducing dependency because of the incumbent actors that are there, while policy is imagining something else, capability development, new skills, new actors, but the systems are actually sustaining that. So we need to be able to really rethink that, so that the manufacturing really doesn't continue to unfold within incumbent shaped socio-technical imaginaries or socio-technical regimes, the procurement rules that are there, the regulatory norms, in the financing logics that are there, which systematically privilege established global actors. So I would want to end it there, just adding to the thoughts that have come through so far. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Julius. That's a really interesting. I've just scribbled that down to make sure we can capture that. Policy imagines capability and systems reproduce dependency. I think that's a really important jumping off point for some further reflections. Jeff, can I just bring in Susan? Susan, you're coming at this from a different place, perhaps, but grappling, I presume, with many of these issues too, from where you sit at the University of Cape Town and H3D. So, what does this look like from your perspective and where you sit as in an African university in a research and development space, trying to engage with manufacturing?
Thank you, John, and a big thank you for actually involving me in this conversation. What a fantastic lineup of speakers. I've really enjoyed all the points that have been brought forward already, and it aligns so much with what we're trying to do. Just taking it back to Nora setting the stage in terms of the different levels. Where we're sitting both at the R&D side. How do we stimulate innovative R&D for health in Africa? And also we're sitting looking at how do we stimulate API manufacturing. And the API manufacturing, I'm so glad, Nora, that you raised it and put it on the table, because so often it's overlooked when we talk about manufacturing on the continent, and everyone is getting excited about a finished product without thinking about how we actually make it. So we are looking to build and connect in from the network from the ground up. And that has been our model from the beginning. So for those of you not aware of the H3D Drug Discovery Center, it is the first integrated drug discovery center on the continent. We have had an antimalarial discovered in our labs, go all the way through into phase 2 clinical trials. We've shown that it can be done And we're now working with partners across Africa to build a pipeline of discovery products that will eventually feed into the market. So that's a big push of what we're doing. And like I said, if you'd asked Professor Kelly Chibali 15 years ago when he set up the center, is it possible? So many people were saying it isn't possible to do it in Africa. And we said, well, we're going to do it anyway. And we've already demonstrated that it is possible. And that's my feeling around the manufacturing as well. We know we can do it. And not only we can, we must, and we must do it better. So our project to stimulate API manufacturing is driven by the same forces we're talking about here. This push between the need for skills, the need for innovation, the how do we really stimulate this industry. And we do have a partnership with CPT Pharma in Pretoria. And one of the biggest existential risks that they have at the moment is actually the talent pipeline. There aren't enough process chemists. If the two current directors were to retire, who would take that forward? Who would lead it? And it's such a fragile system at the moment that we really need to be boosting not only the talent that feeds into this, but also the innovation. And this gets into a slightly different topic, but if we're talking about manufacturing again, a lot of the conversations I've been part of in these big WHO meetings and so on have focused on tech transfer and taking systems that have been developed elsewhere and trying to reproduce them on the continent. I feel very strongly that we need to be innovating and doing better, not just taking systems that have worked in other countries and trying to implement them here. So part of our project is to use a new technology. So we're using flow reactor technology to look at some current ARVs and get the process down. So optimize the process to get the costs down in partnership with CPT. And we've got two of our scientists are going across there next month. They're going to then validate the process on CPT's reactors, get it up to a kilogram level, prove that we can come in at cost competitive using the new technology and validate this to then attract follow-on funding to actually manufacture using the better process. So this is what we're calling a pilot project. We're starting small, just with 2 APIs and saying, can we show that we can improve the process using this technology? But the idea here is we're not only looking at these APIs. That isn't the only outcome of the project. The main one that I'm interested in is we're looking at the model of partnering your academic research institutes with industry, so you can drive both those skills generation. If you've got a decent process chemistry lab at a university, you've got a pipeline of students, you're automatically magnifying the training effect. People are working on projects, they're getting the training while they're doing real projects that can translate to health benefits. And they're also doing the innovation, which can then be partnered with industry to actually do the manufacturing. So I'm quite excited about validating the model and using that as a model to then attract more international funding to roll out the model with partners who have chemistry labs across the continent. I do have one other thing I wanted to put on the table and bring to this conversation. There was a mention of the African diaspora. So we've been in discussions as well with the African Diaspora Network. And just last week in a meeting with them, I was horrified to hear one of the stats that they gave us, which is that 40% of the African diaspora are scientists. It's the scientists that are leaving the continent to go get jobs in countries that have better infrastructure and better resources and better opportunity for them to practice their trade. If we can fix that, we can attract the scientists back and we can keep the scientists that we are already training. The other thing that was put on the table is just, if you look at the African diaspora, they are investing over $100 billion back into the continent every year. And if we can start to harness some of that investment from the diaspora back to the continent to help fix some of these challenges, it can really help be a game changer for accelerating the work we're doing. So I'm going to pause there.
Thank you, Susan. Fantastic. We've already covered so many important aspects here. Maybe I can bring you all back in, Jeff, Julius, Susan, together to reflect on this. I mean, what are we not talking about in discussions on African pharmaceutical futures? What are perhaps the most consequential things we could be doing? We have a few questions in the chat as well, which we can bring in. So I'll just read those out for you now, in case you can also weave any responses to these into your remarks. So Moses Alobo at the Science for Africa Foundation in Nairobi is asking whether we've seen a change in the offtake agreements being done to incentivize new investments. We're seeing any cross-border advanced market commitments, etc., that would encourage new manufacturing lines. Alex Quateng, this might be a question later for Dr. Fomendan, is asking whether the AMA has invested in relevant research and development in clinical trials, given genetic variabilities on the continent, and comments that the AMA is most often seen as a regulator, not necessarily as a co-developer. So it picks up on the issues of trust that are quite important there. And then finally, Edward Sutherland, who comes from Ensan University in Ghana, is asking about how we can create long-term partnerships between universities, industry, government, and development partners that continue beyond the donor-funded projects, which, as we know, are also fragile and part of the fragility of the system. So let me hand it over to you. Pick up the themes that really resonate for you. Jeff, maybe you can go first.
Thanks, John. I think I'll try to answer the question by Moses Alobo, who asked, have we seen a change in the offtake agreements being done to incentivize new investment in farm manufacturing in Africa? I am not sure we've seen that many, but that's the point I was alluding to when I spoke about innovative procurement. Now, if we can veer a little bit off pharmaceuticals, a long time ago, before my head was turning gray, we used to have those TV screens that looked like, computer screens that looked like the TVs. And the federal government in the US actually said, if you're buying any monitor for any computer for the federal government, you will buy a thin or a flat screen. And that created a new market. So that's market formation for a new product. And that's what allowed these investors in these new technologies or in the thin flat screens to be able to become mainstream. So Julius spoke about the issue of the power of incumbency. Nobody wants to have their bread taken away from their mouth. And that's what will happen in African settings. For as long as we let institutions that have existed for the last 5-6 decades to exist, it becomes difficult to actually change these things around. So there is a need for institutional unlearning, and sometimes you actually need a very violent disjuncture with the past to actually start new things. So what is it that African Pharma Futures, as discussed currently, has not looked at? I would want to borrow from the terms that Julius used. I think Julius is becoming a science technology society kind of scholar. So social technical imaginary is a very academic way of saying what are the future social and technical innovations that we want. And whenever you avail money for innovation, public funding is usually very, very limited. And the only way that as a government you can legitimate the allocation of those scarce resources to invest in this thing that sometimes has a 90% chance of failure is to create this social technical imaginary, to create this technical and social imaginary of the future to say, look, we are here, but we can actually get to a higher stage where we are better off. That way you legitimate allocation of scarce public resources into this innovation. So to go back to Moses, one of the ways that you can create a social technical imaginary is that of global health security. But we've previously argued that global health security is actually underwritten or built on the foundations, if you go architecture analogy, on the foundations of local health security. And COVID showed us this. So some of the African pharma futures that we should envision is a secure Africa but not only a secure Africa, but a secure Africa that contributes to global health security in the sense that it actually deals with the problem of concentration risks that we saw during COVID. So if you have one geography producing APIs, when that geography is hit by a natural disaster or is cut off because of things like COVID, then the rest of the world is at risk. So when you develop these, I think they call them distributed manufacturing systems, it becomes a secure future. So I think this is the kind of imagining of a 20, 50-year future and saying to ourselves, what do we need to do in Cape Town as we're building API so that 50 years from now, we are secure and we become a global player in assuring the security of the whole. So I think it's that long range thinking that is not available in the way that we are thinking of the futures. And John, if you allow me, I'll veer off a little. One of the challenges that I face is the way that we have capabilities, but we don't find them. So Susan, a long time ago, actually 36 years ago, as a first-year chemistry student, we actually produced aspirin from the constituent molecules. So literally making the API and everything else until we had an aspirin tablet after, I think, about 3-4 weeks of organic chemistry experiments. That's 36 years ago at the University of Zimbabwe. Now, that capability was there 36 years ago, but why don't we have API manufacturing capabilities in these countries? And Julius and I trained as biotechnologists another 30 years ago. And Julius, of that class, I think, could come back to you, Susan, I think 80 to 90% of our colleagues are all outside Zimbabwe. So we need to build these talent pipelines, and we need to build these ecosystems that allow us or give us the leverage that we require to be able to achieve these 50-year, 100-year socio-technical imaginaries. So this long-range thinking is what I think is missing in how we envision the pharma futures. I'm sorry, John, I've answered you like a politician, but I'm sure in that milieu of words, I've covered this stuff.
Thank you, Jeff. I think they're really useful contributions. Julius, perhaps I could ask you to reflect on any part of this conversation which really grabs you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Susan, for the thoughts that you have put in. For me, in terms of what's not being talked about, I'll go back to the issue of incumbency or incumbents. I think that's something that really needs to be talked about some more. And how do we actually confront that? There's definitely need for epistemic broadening. Sometimes we use very narrow lenses in terms of understanding this ecosystem, but it's very much an ecosystem which is about history, it's about geography, it's about geopolitics. So we need to bring all those different ways of knowing and ways of thinking into the conversation, because that's how we will avoid reproducing the kind of dependencies that are there when we begin to challenge this context from different angles. And then linking to the question from is it Edward around how do we build sustainable partnerships? That is really, really crucial. And for me, it links back to what I've just mentioned around epistemic broadening, that sometimes those actors that are missing from the conversations are so central for making sure that we can sustain the conversations and the partnerships that are going on. Then there's also a notion that I've been working on, which is what I'm calling relational capability. That while we invest in technical capabilities, governance capabilities, policy capabilities, but how do we invest in relationships that are built on trust, on equitable partnerships, and on knowledge co-production, which is genuine, and they don't just happen. Just like the socio-technical imaginaries that Jeff was talking about, they don't just emerge, they're actually a result of deliberate choices and actions, including deliberate investments as well. So investors, I mean, funders in the room or funders in this conversation should actually invest in relationships, invest in partnerships, so that we've got relational capability is one of the ways that we can actually sustain partnerships. And that links into the question on vaccine hesitancy that was mentioned earlier. I think it was by Dr. Fomundam, that because we don't involve society, we don't have architectures or mechanisms that actually make society part of the upstream and the downstream conversations in vaccine manufacturing, for example. Then it becomes a problem when we want to just bolt on that they should accept the vaccines, but they should actually be part of the continuum of conversation that you're having. So investing in relational capabilities is important for sustaining the partnerships that we are talking about. So those are my additions at this point. Thank you very much. Maybe Susan, you want to?
I would love to. I picked on that question as well, Julius. I think, this is one of the things that we should be seeing more of, is these relationships between academic and industry partners. And if you look at it, there are synergies from all sides. One of the big challenges for universities and research centers is wanting to ensure that their graduates get jobs. I mean, it's put job creation on the table. Who's going to create those jobs? Not the universities. It's the industry that's really going to power and create employment and also sustain the universities ultimately. So there's this real incentive to partner with industries to feed that job creation and help your graduates get employed. And the other piece of it is the funding. So for example, if I look at this current project, this pilot project I'm doing with CPT Pharma, we have international funding that's going to help us do this proof of concept. If we do it enough times, it's going to become cost effective for industries to get the research done, the innovation done at the universities. So you're going to start to see risk sharing, benefit sharing, and industry actually funding some of the research that happens in these academic centers, which are doing the training. So it really, there's so many benefits from these types of partnerships, and we need more African research institutions to see this and to actively build these partnerships. Julius, I completely agree with you when you talk about building that trust. It doesn't just happen. A lot of our university, the tech transfer officers or the lawyers, they're not comfortable even putting these agreements in place. They don't know how to structure them. I mean, one of the things that we've had to do is to say, well, stop thinking about traditional IP. If we are actually improving a process for process chemistry, that's going to be a trade secret. We're talking about generic drugs that we need to manufacture locally. We cannot be patenting or publishing. It's a completely different paradigm. And a lot of the universities wouldn't feel comfortable even entering into that sort of space. So there's some institutional strengthening that needs to happen. And then you need the champions, the scientists at the institutions to really lead and forge those human partnerships to make this work. And I think, we're talking about how all these things intersect. One of the big challenges we also face as early stage or R&D researchers in Africa is access to the basic, the reagents or the infrastructure to support what we need to do. And it all feeds together. So when we're thinking about process chemistry as well, we're not just thinking manufacturing to support the end user. We're thinking manufacturing to support R&D, to support preclinical studies, to support clinical studies. Who's actually doing that manufacturing to support the R&D and the value chain the whole way along. Currently, if we've got a TB candidate that's going through late stage preclinical tox, and those studies, we're having to outsource the scale-up work to China, to do the tox studies. So when we think about the whole ecosystem, we really need to be strengthening at each point of it. So that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you, Susan. I'm just going to go through the chat and pick a few more questions out. Dr. Fomundam, if you want to also join us as well, there may be some questions here coming on the back of your contributions earlier. There's a question here from Dr. Jordan Kayongo. Going back to the fundamental question you've all raised, who do you think should take responsibility for governance/coordination and challenging these incumbent systems and really amplifying the potential that you've all talked about? Who wants to take that question first?
Yeah, I can jump in quickly. Or Dr. Fomundam, did you want to come in?
No, you can go ahead, Julius. I would add, and then also answer the question from Alex. You can go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'll just share some thoughts there. I think government should really take responsibility for that governance function which you're raising, Jordan. And for me, just standing back, I think manufacturing failure it's a coordination failure, just like we're talking about. It's really about coordination. And I think it's also about the institutional altitude. Like where are these discussions happening? And sometimes you see that they're happening in health, they're happening in industry, they're happening in finance, and decisions are being made in those silos, so to speak. So why do we not have elevation of these conversations to the right institutional altitude? Because health security or manufacturing capabilities are not just a health sector issue. These are broad national issues we are talking about. These are macroeconomic stabilization issues we are talking about, which go beyond what the Minister of Health should do or the Minister of Finance on his own. So we need to have that kind of locus that actually reconciles the trade-offs that are there between these different ministries, because they all have got what they're focusing on. But ultimately, these are national development issues we are talking about. So elevating the conversations, that governance function to the right institutional altitude would really be able to help. Because what would result if we have these silos, we can have capacity without markets. Just like what Dr. Fomendam was highlighting around, if each country is going to manufacture, for example, well, what's going to happen? We'll have capacity without markets, and then we can have ambition without authority. We can have a very big ambition to say this is what we want to do, but there's actually no authority to do that, because they haven't been elevated to the right altitude in terms of the governance function that's supposed to hold everything together. So those are my quick reflections on that question from Jordan, which is really fundamental, like you said. Dr. Fomunda.
Maybe, John, could I push Julius back a little?
Sure. Let's.
So Julius is my brother. I've known Julius for a long time. He won't hit me. I know a lot of times we do say that governments should take the governance coordination of challenging incumbents. But could I come in with another angle, Julius, and use real life examples?
Yeah.
So the Serum Institute of India was not set up by the government. It was a family that liked horses and went on, and from there, I mean, it's one of the biggest biologics production institution that we have in the world. So if we're to borrow from the terms that you introduced earlier of socio-technical imaginaries, you can have socio-technical imaginaries that are actually framed by government, but you can also have socio-technical imaginaries that are framed by the private sector. And you can have socio-technical imaginaries that are framed across multiple partners. So here is an example of a socio-technical imaginary that was developed by the private sector, but now the Serum Institute of India is critical for global health security. If we then come back to government, which is where you are, so I'm pushing you back, but I'm also pulling you. If we go to Zimbabwe, around about the 1980s, 1990s, Zimbabwe had a serious issue with HIV/AIDS. And what Zimbabwe did was unprecedented. It simply said, look, we have local manufacturing companies and we need ARVs. The ARVs that are there are expensive. And so the government of Zimbabwe says, we are going to ignore the patents. You guys who are local, if you produce these ARVs, we will buy them from you. And even before they started producing the ARVs, they actually allocated foreign currency to these companies to actually import the ARVs. And so Zimbabwe is one of the first African countries to locally manufacture ARVs as far back as 2002. So this now is a public socio-technical imaginary, but that then integrated itself. But the reason why it was able to translate that is because there was an industry that had been in existence since the 1950s. So the capabilities were there. So they were able to leverage these capabilities, but I think Dr. Fomendam was talking about government will. And so there was government will, and it was also linked to a very, I think, innovative Minister of Health who was there was Dr. Timothy Stamps. So is this constellation of actors were in the Ministry of Health, were able to influence the Ministry of Finance and influence the Ministry of Industry, go and talk to industry and interlink and actually bring these life-saving medications. So who is responsible? I think it depends. Now I'm talking like an economist. It depends. It can be the private sector, it can be the public sector, but it can be a conjoining of different sectors who can work on this. Now, Julius, you can shoot me all you want. Thanks.
No, I'll not shoot you, Jeff. I'll just sort of add more nuance to what you're saying, really, which is about these interdependencies that are there between different actors. And I think that links into one of the conversations that always comes into this space as well around sovereignty. Like, what does sovereignty actually mean? What does it look like? It's not autarky. It's not disengaging or pushing out other actors or saying we are not going to be part of the global value chains because we want to do things on our own. But just realizing that there are those interdependencies, including how different actors can come in and occupy certain spaces within the ecosystem. Government, of course, still remains responsible for creating that space where other actors can be able to come in. So that coordination architecture overseen by the government is still very important, because it really then puts in place the right demand signals, the regulatory predictability that is important. How does that align to the industrial strategy? How does that actually give a clear sort of indication of what the risk sharing arrangements are like, so that can then translate into sustainable and investable ecosystems for different actors to come. So the government still remains very important in that, but they're actually just putting in place the coordination architecture where other actors can see where they fit in. So that's, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm not shooting you, but really just extending, we're bringing more nuance that it's about that coordination architecture, which the government still remains very central in creating and sustaining.
Thank you, Julius. And I think we've got a great example here of where trusted conversations can really kind of bring ideas together. You obviously built that over a long period. Dr. Fomendan and Dr. Winks, perhaps I could ask you, we've got a few more minutes left before we need to close the session, or we'll presumably start to lose people as they drop off for other commitments. Any final reflections from you both? Jobs and the private sector, those are two things that we've just pulled up as well, which might be worth a comment.
So John, I just want to pick up on one of the things Julia said. So if I look at what we've been able to build at the University of Cape Town, this Drug Discovery Centre, we have done it because the South African government supported us as a national platform and continues to give us core baseline funding to help us sustain. About 30% of our funding comes from the South African government. We're able to leverage that with international funding, both from private sector, from philanthropies. But without that core funding to hold us and keep us, we would not have been able to build and sustain what we are. The South African government has also put a lot of effort now into creating what they call the API cluster. So it is part of their strategy to support local API manufacturing. And within that framework, it becomes easier for me to form a partnership with CPT Pharma and so on. So I think having governments set the right frameworks is absolutely critical to help us thrive. I mentioned earlier, we've got partners across Africa, and watching them try to create these research infrastructures in the absence of strong government support is really hard. So we do need more governments getting on board and helping to build and coordinate what we're doing here.
Thank you. Dr. Fomendan.
Well, John, thank you very much. The reason why I've really enjoyed your meeting today and the discussion is because a lot of presentations that I give and participate, it's usually people spending a lot of time diagnosing, which I think we've overly diagnosed what is happening on the continent and we're aware of it. But today, I'm glad I'm hearing solutions. I'm hearing interventions. I'm hearing things that we should be doing. But just to quickly piggyback on the role of government, it just cannot be downplayed. At minimum, what we want governments to do is to create an enabling environment, particularly for the private sectors, for the investors that are coming into the country. So if they don't even understand and appreciate what they're looking for and what they want, then we would keep chasing our tails. And that's why you see the incumbent, which Julius was describing, keeps thriving because the government hasn't taken control, hasn't taken hold of it. We've just spoken about AMA, that everybody was looking very excited. AMA is coming, AMA is coming. And one of the things that I wrote in my recommendation is that to manage the expectation. Now, AMA has come, and very few African countries are putting their own money in it. So it's very donor driven, and it's external donor. Here we speak about ownership. And I think Alex was asking about clinical trials. AMA is probably not going to be anytime soon setting up their own clinical trials. It would grow to that level. But I think what I wrote in the recommendation was for AMA to have an advisory team that looks at what is happening in the different countries on clinical trials. It's something that we want to advise. I served on the clinical trials committee in South Africa for 10 years, and we were very encouraged and happy that a lot of multi-country trials were coming to South Africa. That's because South Africa built the infrastructure for clinical trials. We were meeting like every 2 weeks because there were too many trials that were coming because of the infrastructure. And there are a lot of questions I would ask. We review protocols, we look at your ethics, we look at the trials that came from Africa that we look at and question that who approved this trial? What kind of ethics committee do they have? And we discovered that you have an ethics committee that is made up of husband, wife, and a couple of friends and things like that. So in terms of clinical trials, I think the first mandate that I think AMA should be able to do is to be able to assist the different countries. Some of them don't have a clinical trials committee, they don't have a protocol, they don't have any of that in place, and they could create it. But again, government, like I said, it's not just government will, it's government prioritizing. And if the African governments don't begin to talk instead of just this on paper that talks about ownership, we're just going to keep chasing our tails because they need to put in their money into it. And just to emphasize that medicine regulation must be strengthened if we have to progress with the local manufacturing or what Susan is working on, the APIs, which is going to be critical. And as I said, there's going to be definition for what a local manufacturing entity is. Where did your API come from? If you are not sourcing proper API from the continent and everything else, it's coming, then you may not benefit from the African continental free trade area. That's a way that they want to make sure Africa is also producing APIs, which I think that's the right thing to do. And it provokes me a little bit to talk about what you call neglected diseases in Africa. Neglected by whom? And I really hate the name because it means it's been neglected. The definition of it is that it's neglected by the big pharma, by the big pharmaceutical industry. So where are the African scientists? Why should your mother or your parent die from a neglected disease? That's in itself is a stigma that somebody died from a neglected disease. Neglected by whom? So the African research institutions should get into this with the research agenda. Why do we still have sleeping sickness, which is one of the neglected diseases and things like that? And call it a different name, not neglected disease. In the US, a category like that is called the orphan drug and orphan disease. These are diseases that are affecting about less than 200,000 people. But in Africa, we call it neglected because it is actually neglected by the West. So where are our own scientists? So there are a number of things that we can talk about, but this is a good group, and I've been very proud to be part of you because you're coming up with solutions. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Dr. Thomdan, and thank you all. I mean, it feels terrible to cut this conversation off now when I think we could go on for much longer. And I hope it's just the start, actually, of a conversation which we can pick up and evolve and develop. And I think there's so many important threads here that we need to draw together. I'm aware that everybody has only signed up for a 75-minute conversation today, so I don't want to keep everyone longer. I want to respect your time, but we will pick these threads up. We will look to convene another conversation in the coming months and see who else we need to bring into this. From our side, we really want to understand here, where can we play a useful role? This is why we are convening these conversations and bringing these partners together. There's clearly something important here about the talent pipeline we need to develop. I think Judith and Jesse both use this idea of the social cultural imaginary or socio-technical imaginary, sorry. And this is about imagining something which is possible and laying the foundations now so that it does become possible in decades to come. And so we clearly need to think now not only about what we need tomorrow, but what we need much further down the line. Thank you all for making the time. I'm aware we haven't got to all of the questions, but we'll pick some of those up. We will make this recording available and share a brief readout from it, a note with everybody. There are a few questions in the chat from colleagues in Ghana about INASP's role and where national science foundations can come into this. They're clearly an important part of the picture and that interface between government and between the scientific research system in their countries. So plenty of questions and food for thought. But thank you very much for joining us today, and keep in touch, and we will let you know how we can move this conversation forward in the next few weeks and months.